We will discuss today the cooperation nexus between civil society and local governments, and how this cooperation can contribute to enhanced local democratic resilience in the region. I'm warmly welcoming our speakers, Clara Volintiru, GMF Racing CE Fellow and Associate Professor at the Bucharest University of Economic Studies, who is the author of our today's paper, and Paul Costello, GMF Cities Program Manager, who will serve as our discussant. My name is Daniel Hegedűs. I serve as Fellow for Central Europe at GMF, and I'm really sorry for my voice. Please bear with me today. As one can see on the examples of numerous countries in the region, cities provide the most fertile breeding ground for democratic attitudes throughout Central and Eastern Europe. They provide supportive environment for progressive cosmopolitan ideas and values, and therefore they are also crucial enablers of electoral success for democratic opposition parties that stands up to and challenge autocratic national regimes. And cities have also been at the forefront in tackling the coronavirus pandemic and its social and economic impacts. There are indeed a couple of positive benchmark examples in CEE, how local governments, civil society, and private companies have worked together to mitigate the crisis. However, there were also negative examples of national governments in the region which have taken advantage of the situation and re-centralized municipal competencies and resources. These attacks on municipal autonomy and local democracy have demonstrated how important is it that cities in the region have proper institutional and economic instruments, and that these instruments are seen as integral parts of the rule of law and democratic accountability. How could better cooperation between cities and local civil society strengthen democratic resilience? How could cities improving fiscal capacities and autonomy contribute to democratic accountability? And what opportunities are harbored in international city networks and other policy learning instruments for the cities in Central and Eastern Europe? I'm looking forward to discussing these questions with our distinguished speakers, Clara Volintiru, who, as I already mentioned, is Associate Professor at the Bucharest University of Economic Studies and our GMF Racing CE Fellow. Clara obtained her PhD from the London School of Economics, and she has been involved in various international research projects in the field of behavioral studies, good governance, informal exchanges, and political economy. She has been a consultant for international organizations such as the World Bank, the European Commission, Eurofound, and the Committee of Regions. Clara is also the New Economy and Society Program Director within the Aspen Institute, Romania. And Paul Costello, who is Program Manager for the GMF Cities program based in our Berlin office. And Paul leads the City Directors of International Affairs Network, the Cities Managing Migration Project, and he's also involved in several other projects that are part of the GMF Cities democracy work. Paul graduated from the Hertie School of Governance with a Master in Public Policy. Clara, Paul, thank you both for joining us today. And regarding the housekeeping rules, Clara will present her paper's main findings in approximately 15 to 20 minutes, followed by Paul comments in roughly the same amount of time. After 45 minutes, we will go into the Q&A, and I would like to encourage you all, ladies and gentlemen, to send me your questions via the Q&A or the chat function of Zoom. And I will either collect your questions and forward them to our speakers, or I will unmute you that you can ask your question in person. I also would like to remind you that the event is recorded and will be available online at the YouTube channel of the German Marshall Fund. And last but not least, I would like to mention that Clara's work at GMF is part of our Rethink CEE Fellowship Program, which was established in order to support the next generation of policy analysts and civic activists from the broader Central and Eastern European region and the Western Balkans. And the main goal of the one-year-long fellowship is to conduct innovative policy research, like those of Clara, and to deliver fresh policy impulses with regard to all of the challenges that are faced throughout the Central and Eastern European region. And having said that, I would like to pass the floor to our main speaker today. Clara, over to you.
Daniel, thank you so much. It's wonderful to change gears and be a speaker rather than a moderator for this time. And thank you so much for the wonderful work that you've been doing with me in preparing this paper throughout the past year. I would like to share my slides because we have a few graphics in the policy paper that I think would be useful to for everyone to see. I don't know if it's something that I could do.
I think maybe we are not able to see that. Do you have the screen sharing option?
No.
Just a second. I think please start with without the charts.
Okay, and sure, no problem.
We will
of course
solve the situation in a second.
The story in the story in this policy paper is rather simple. It's time to account for cities in Central and Eastern Europe to the weight that they have in the geopolitics of the region, which is a much higher weight than many of us would be inclined to think of. When we were discussing before the event, it's like the inverse situation of the mouse and the elephant. When the mouse thinks it's as big as an elephant, well, the opposite is true for the cities in Central and Eastern Europe. Sometimes they think they're much smaller than their actual role in the regional economy and in national democracy. And when I'm talking about cities, you know, who are the entities that we are talking about? We're talking about local governments, we're talking about the citizens, and we're talking about the local business environment. So it's the multitude of stakeholders in Central and Eastern European cities that have put forward a very important, in my opinion, a very important shift towards a new developmental paradigm in the region. In short, I think the convergence of Central and Eastern Europe depends a lot on the economic growth and growth rhythm of cities in Central and Eastern Europe. Furthermore, we need to account for the fact that the richer the cities, the higher the civic involvement is, according to the data that I can present to you today. So it is important when we think about strengthening democratic resilience at national and local level, it is important to remember the old modernization theory that now holds true at the local level. Despite its many failings, we still can see a positive correlation between economic growth and economic development and civic engagement and the quality of democracy. So I think now we can turn to some of the slides. I'm not sure I can, you know, I'm just gonna send the slides to Daniel, and he can share them with you. Now, in terms of
you are co-host now. I think you
okay.
have to have this screen sharing option in the front.
Okay, I think it works. So sorry. There it is. So sorry for this.
No problem.
Can you see it now?
Yes.
Perfect, and I can see myself in the lower corner, which is nice. Looking at local democratic resilience, I want to signal first and foremost the fact that there have been quite a few papers lately on democratic resilience in general, but especially in Central and Eastern Europe, where we've seen some trouble signs, and I think that area of studies, and I'm going to talk about them in a minute, can be very nicely declined at local level. We can test many of those arguments also at local level. So this study adds to some of the existing papers that GMF and other outlets have published already. Okay, so moving into what exactly should we look at when we look at local democratic resilience, we probably should look at how the weight of cities, how important cities are in the national economies. And this policy paper will look specifically at Romania, Poland, and Hungary, because these are the largest economies in the region whose share of the economy depends a lot on cities, and the growth of cities has been, as I mentioned before, one of the driving elements for these three countries. Of course, this also can be said about Bulgaria and the Czech Republic, but turning back to these three large countries, you also have an interesting differentiation between them. So you have a much higher urban population in the case of Hungary and a much lower urban population in the case of Romania. They have together amassed the largest share of EU funding and GDP growth in the past years. And they amass one of the largest share in the region of foreign direct investment, which as I will mention in a minute, is again concentrated very much around leading cities. Now, they are also differentiated in one important aspect, the fact that Poland and Hungary have registered a democratic decline at national level, as we can see in the liberal democracy score by the Varieties of Democracy Index from Gothenburg Institute. And there were also recent pandemic violations in terms of democratic standards, issues that have not been found in the Romanian case. So it's interesting to see how this type of democratic resilience at local level plays out both in a contentious environment like the one in Hungary and Poland, where cities are in fact struggling against the national governments, and in a more cooperative environment, political environment like the one that we can find in the Romanian case study. For all of Central and Eastern European countries, the convergence to the European Union, the economic convergence, has been one of their major sources of democratic consolidation and success, albeit, as some of the GMF fellows mentioned, sometimes the EU funding and foreign direct investments have been inadvertently used to consolidate national regimes. So there's a double-edged sword there in terms of EU funding and foreign direct investments. Now, because cities create these economic multiplication effects in their region, they are essentially the primary vectors of economic development for these countries. And that is why their path to growth must be very carefully guided with future public policies. And that's why this is a public policy paper in the end and not just an academic article, because a lot depends on how national and European public policy will be structured in the coming years. Structured in a manner that can allow this growth to continue, but structured in a manner that can also account for other redistributional goals towards lagging regions and rural areas. So we need to very focusedly construct what I call differentiated pathways to grow, with cities needing more liberty and more room to expand and grow, and they will also need to consolidate their internal attributes. Okay, wealth has tended to concentrate in certain metropolitan areas, urban and peri-urban, whose highly trained human capital and connectivity was fit for the new knowledge-based economy. But this also left, and that's an important cue to remember, this also left shrinking cities in the formal industrial regions of these countries in the claws of poverty and or populism. And we can see a growing number of studies on this issue. And that's why it is so important to balance the growth of leading urban centers with the pathways of development for these lagging regions that have become nests for Euroscepticism and various democratic distortive political actors. Now, in terms of looking at these national policies, right, at this equilibrium, this balance between central and local governments, we can see a very differentiated image across Central and Eastern Europe. Although the European Union has supported a balance of powers that, as you can see, the EU average is a ratio of 2 to 4 between central expenditures and local expenditures. And in Western democracies, you can see this type of balanced relationship between central and local governments. Across the Central and Eastern European region, you find a much more diverse picture of the balance of powers between central and local governments, with the highest level of centralization in the case of Hungary, where the national government outspends local governments by 5 times, and a much more decentralized Poland, where the central government is almost on par with local governments in terms of expenditures. Now, why does this matter? Because I just said in the previous breath that sometimes cities lack technical capacity. So why should we give more resources to local governments if they don't have the means to administer them? But the truth is, and here I'm quoting one of my fellow scholars who did a lot of work on decentralization in Ukraine, and that proved to work very well. So the quote is, "There's nothing worse than a mayor chasing a grant or a central allocation." Why? Because we find mayors spending more time at central level harnessing the political relationship with national leaders rather than catering to the local needs and the local potential. And in the new economic paradigm that we all live in, with a higher localization and very sophisticated engagement with economic actors, you can actually have a lot of work harnessing the local development rather than depending on central transfers. And that's why the argument goes, the ratio should be more balanced in terms of how much budgetary capacity, sustainable budgetary capacity local governments should have in Central and Eastern Europe in comparison to their reliance on national transfers. One of our recent studies that is not directly part of this policy paper, but is an academic article, showcases the extent to which the higher decentralization, the lower clientelistic relationships are between local and central governments. So, you know, if we want accountable cities, we actually need to have local governments that have the power to manage their city affairs to the full of the extent. Now, how are we supposed to actually make sure that there isn't more capture and more politicization with this decentralization and more opaque, let's say, budgetary allocations? Well, this is the contribution of the policy paper, and what I argue is, and I argued before in a report for the World Bank in Romania, what I argue is that the key is in the mutual engagement at local level. So what public policy actors need to account for is how to harness this mutual engagement between civic society and local governments. That will be the best check and balance you can imagine. Citizens being engaged in how their municipal affairs are being managed, and local officials being open to and reactive to the needs of their constituencies. And of course, this builds on a long history of, theoretizing local governance. But in fact, it is something quite new given the context of the pandemics, because empirically, we found so many fabulous examples of grassroots action and initiatives in cities across Europe and America. And their actions have actually been able to compensate for the failures of national administrative capacities. And that's not to say that centralization is not necessary during a pandemics. I subscribe to the fact that efficiency sometimes requires central action, but I also can showcase, and in the policy brief, you can find so many examples where local communities have brought up solutions that national governments could not. So this model of mutual engagement builds on one side the fact that you need a strong civil society at local level, and that means citizen engagement, everyday citizens looking for information from their local governments, sharing their ideas with local governments, participating and proposing solutions. and also civil society organizations that can act as platform for those interests and needs. And on the other hand, you have local governments that need to actively engage in open governance and transparency. And we have in the policy paper some examples of participatory budgeting and participatory governance. Now, this is important, as I mentioned, because now and from now on, cities will be at the forefront not just of the pandemics, but also climate action, various disaster relief initiatives, and every sort of ad hoc reaction at local level depends on this social capital that is fostered between the community and their elected leaders. Now, it is also important to account for the fact that civil society in Central and Eastern Europe holds many faces, probably much like elsewhere. It is less organized than in Western Europe. It is more divided between progressive and conservative stances. And sometimes the actors that are better organized are not the ones that are necessarily building on chains of representation of societal needs, but rather more narrow interests in the society. So in that sense, there need to be some targeted action towards building better capacity at local level for civil society actors. But overall, in the secondary cities where we have that capacity, mutual engagement works very well towards the co-production of public services at local level. Now, I know this is such a dense chart, and it would probably fit better in an academic presentation, but I promise this is the last bit of information I'm sharing, so bear with me for a second. Behind my head, so I will try to move like this, you can see, I feel like a professor in the classroom again with the blackboard behind me. So the accountability relationship between citizens and local government works better in cities, and I think that's a non-disputable fact. You can relate much better to the elected officials that you can meet on the streets, even if we're talking about a larger city. And I think this is a very often underlooked fact when we talk about democratic resilience in Central and Eastern Europe. So much ink is spilled on how we can reinforce national structures, where at the end of the day, the battleground is at local level. So what we've done is to chart the relative capabilities of different cities, of all leading cities in Hungary, Poland, and Romania. And here I would like to acknowledge the amazing data gathering work of my research assistants, Goshka and Daniel. And of course, the work that we've done in Romania as well with the World Bank. So what we come up with is this comprehensive mapping of capabilities on the part of civil society and local governments in all leading cities in the targeted 3 areas. And you find 4 scenarios. So you have mutual engagement scenario, which is the ideal one, and which is in the upper right corner in dark blue. And we can see for the case of Hungary that only 3 cities qualify in that scenario, which is Budapest, Szombathely, and Tatabánya. In the case of Romania, and I'm going to come right back to why this is. In the case of Romania, we find more cities qualifying in the optimal scenario of mutual engagement. But interestingly enough, for Romania, you find Cluj, which is a secondary city, scoring much, much higher than the capital city of Bucharest. And this is a differentiating factor from Hungary and Poland, where the top rank is ensured by the capital cities. Now, the explanation for the leading role of capital cities is once again what I mentioned before, a much better consolidated capacity within the branch of civil society. So having more engaged civil society actors actually drives up the index of mutual engagement in a way that in secondary cities you don't really see it happening. But also in leading cities and capital cities, local governments have a wider array of personnel, employees, and skills. Because let's think about open government for a moment. You need IT experience, you need different background in international affairs to tackle these new issues such as climate change. And so the more professional employees you have, the more able the better equipped you are to engage with citizens in a meaningful manner. A wonderful example I just encountered in Cluj, for example, through consultations with their local community, they found out that people really need school transport. So because it's a growing IT city, a lot of parents work from home. They don't want to spend a lot of time in traffic taking their kids to school. So what the local government in Cluj did as a consequence of that was to introduce as many as 29 transport lines for children. And I can tell you that is an enormous draw factor for future professionals in that city, and drawing in professionals that have higher value-added activities will ultimately increase the fiscal base of the city and increase its resources. So this is a virtuous cycle that we're talking about. Now, coming back to the worst scenarios, which is the CSO's unfulfilled potential. This is the scenario where you have much more engagement from local governments than you have from the civil society. And it translates in situation, in context where local governments are transparent about their actions, they publish everything they need to publish. As you can see in the case of Poland, great many cities cluster within this area because the legislation is mandatory for local governments to publish much more information and to engage in more participatory actions than in the case of Romania and Hungary. So this type of policy reform is very important for driving up mutual engagement and local capabilities. But coming back to the point, you have governments in Hungary being transparent about their activities and funding and engaging in collaborative actions with local CSOs, but not so many CSOs being willing to engage with local government actors. Sooner, based on interviews, CSOs in Hungary are focusing on national level issues and national level actors. So this is something that might need some adjustment as well in terms of the locus of action and intervention. And I think the worst case scenario, and in Romania we can see quite a lot of cities, is when you have mutual disengagement. So neither the local government nor the local community is very eager to engage with each other. I think in terms of, and this is actually where I will stop, in terms of my recommendations, you know, the list is quite long, but just to synthesize it in one short slide. I tried to create the multi-level framework that I'm very much a fan of, and building a top-down from the international community. I think international donors can do quite a lot in support of the design and implementation of better local level metrics on democratic resilience. And here I would be remiss not to mention the fact that there are, as I mentioned at the beginning of my intervention, there are quite a few great studies on national democratic resilience, including from my colleagues in Romania from Global Focus, but there are not that many on local democratic resilience. And we recently received a feedback from a funding application with the European Commission that local mutual engagement metrics might not have European added value. So I think this type of framing where you think local affairs are not relevant to the European security and cohesion, I think that's damaging to the European cohesion itself. Now, in terms of European institution, I would also suggest supporting across European harmonization of the fiscal balance of powers between national and local governments, just to ensure that cities can escape this trapped clientele status that many cities in Central and Eastern Europe have. And of course, the new funding program, the multi-annual financial program, does quite a lot in offering cities the direct access to EU funding. But we also need to be careful of the fact that smaller cities don't have the internal capacity to access funding directly, and they will continue to be dependent on central transfers. Now, in terms of the national governments, I think we definitely need to support better integrated and transparent data sets for government and cities, and that's a must for evidence-based policymaking. I don't see how a national government could steer effectively its economy or its political internal affairs, take the case of the pandemics, without a proper vision over local capabilities. And of course, local governments in their turn can increase their engagement with both local, the community level, but national and international stakeholders to proactively develop their common political and economic platform for cities. As I mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, cities are better than they are, greater and better than they think they are. And the international dialogue and their international stance can be a very important source of strength for their development. And within this regard, I strongly recommend appointed officials on international affairs, appointed local officials on sustainable development and resilience. And finally, the CSO, the civil society organizations, can do a lot to improve local government's capacity for policy making through collaboration and co-design. Now, the idea is to work together and not against each other. So maybe this policy paper supplies some additional argument for what I already consider to be quite the obvious truth.
Thank you so much, Clara, for this so provoking analysis and for the very clear and concise recommendations at the end. And I am sure that we will come back to a couple of your points, what you made. But now coming to the comments. Paul, you are a policy practitioner at the field of local democracy. What were your key takeaways from Clara's paper, and how were her findings and recommendations resonate with your experiences from your practical policy work? Over to you, Paul.
Yeah. Thanks, Daniel, and thanks, Clara, for the great work and interesting presentation. I have quite a few reflections relating to what Clara presented in her work and how it's also relevant to cities and societies beyond the three countries sort of studied in depth. And just for a little bit of background from the perspective of the GMF Cities program, we work with cities across Europe and North America on different topics, of which strengthening democracy is one of the key ones. And the way we work on most of these projects, including on our democracy work, is by convening city leaders and practitioners and bring them together with experts and research, like this work that Clara's just presented us. And I'll keep it short, but I'll add a series of reflections and thoughts and different points, and then look forward to some questions and comments on the audience, and we can go back deeper onto some of the things that Clara presented. And again, want to commend and congratulate Clara on this work. It's really useful for many reasons, and I'll start with one, which is this measurement of mutual engagement is really an excellent operationalization of something key, and it's useful because it's done in a way that is replicable and applicable in different ways, and can serve as a tool for practitioners and policymakers. And essentially what I like most about it is that it captures the dynamic relationship that many indexes and measurements don't, and that is really key to measuring local democracy. And a measurement or an index of local democracy is something we've been looking at quite seriously in the GMF Cities program. And again, fits in with one of the recommendations by Clara of sort of furthering local diagnostics on this issue, which I think is super important. And the mutual engagement, it takes it a step beyond what we have until now, because we could collect data on what institutions are offering for participatory mechanisms or forums, And we can also measure voter turnout, as the OECD does. But how they work together is really what's important there. If on either of these things, if it's one-sided, it's meaningless. Even the best of intentions, and you can organize the most participatory mechanisms at the local level, but if people don't participate, then something's wrong. It's not working. And even with good intentions, it's not properly done. And the ultimate effect is really zero. And this is kind of this circular relationship that's mentioned in the paper. And I think this, not just on this sort of civic engagement or mutual engagement element, but this dynamic relationship is really key. And when we think about measurements of democracy at the local level, we look to really get those kind of elements in different aspects of local governance. Related to that, which I think is also important to mention on this in the area of mutual engagement, is expectations, or really allowing us to look at the dynamics of causation within that, sort of how come in some places there's more engagement than in others. It's not just the opportunities offered by the city, it's also long-term, when residents and civil society see that their input or their participation matters and it translates into actual policy outcomes, that obviously encourages further participation. So it's often self-reinforcing in that sense, but really better understanding how those dynamics work, I think is very important for local leaders and practitioners. And on the issue of expectations, we have an ongoing project called Cities Fortifying Democracy, bringing together 6 American and 6 European cities around the topic of strengthening democracy. And on participation, one of the things that the cities are flagging as a challenge is that it's a challenge. It's a struggle for them to adapt and act more quickly with their participatory mechanisms, and staying within their institutional systems of collaboration and consultation. And this is especially recently with sort of increased activism and growing civil society groups, especially around the issues of climate and racial injustice. Cities are not always sort of equipped institutionally, legally, to respond with the sort of urgency and pressure that new groups who perhaps haven't been as engaged in the past or haven't been included in certain mechanisms expect or hope. And certain change and certain policies and certain processes take time to process and digest, and it can be hugely frustrating to the people engaging, as well as for the practitioners who are trying to channel this engagement into policy and politics. And this expectation is super important, because certain mechanisms can also generate more frustration or worsen certain situations. And I think this also goes to the issue of taxation and fiscal governance that Clara talks about. And I think it kind of mirrors mutual engagement in that sense, where there's expectations generated and then capacity follows, and they kind of reinforce each other. When people are contributing more in revenues to local government, they expect more, and that kind of supports each other. And while I agree with the arguments made by Clara on fiscal decentralization, I would just sort of flag one of the potential dangers, especially for these big capital cities that are really dominant in national economies, where there can be an incentive to lower taxes that are devolved because the capital cities' weight and size in the economy allows it to sort of generate enough revenue and can just lower taxes and attract and siphon businesses and wealth from the surrounding region, sort of making worse one of the key problems that Clara talks about in the paper, which is this sort of urban-rural divide. And I think in this case, arguably in Spain, it's the case in Madrid, where they've sort of lowered certain taxes to the minimum and attracted sort of many businesses and wealthy individuals who have relocated either in reality or shifting their addresses to there to pay less taxes, and that's kind of creating certain regional tensions. Also would like to bring in another element that we look at in our Cities Fortifying Democracy project that I think is interesting and relates to kind of the civil society aspect, which is that of local journalism and media as a sort of connective tissue where sort of people can become more engaged or be more informed to engage or engage in a more informed way. And this is talked about more in the US context, where we're seeing it everywhere, but this decline in local media outlets, but it's studied more in the US, where we have really these maps of news deserts. And I think this is something that's going to become a bigger problem, and it's an important threat to cities and broader democratic societies that we should be paying attention to. Generally, I think all this work is really relevant, not just across Europe, but also North America, and probably beyond that, and be interesting to sort of extend this work at some point as well. But also want to pick up on one of the points of sort of mayor in the paper of mayors being as sort of challengers to the political system, or being not aligned with their national governments in terms of party systems. And I think we can, I don't have the numbers, but we can see that across different countries, and also kind of reflects this urban-rural divide. And we've seen in very recent times, and currently, sort of mayors emerging as challengers to national leaders. I mean, the mayor of Warsaw very recently, the mayor of Budapest at the moment, the mayor of Paris just declaring. And while I think that's fantastic, and I think that is one of the things that ties into the recommendations as sort of a change mechanism, which is, having these mayors maybe then elected to national governments can then change the competence setup and allow cities to have more fiscal competences or different things. But there's also the risk of it having the opposite effect of sort of cities having their competences reduced and being punished or limiting their competences, to not want to sort of allow mayors to emerge as challengers in a political system, and sort of having these major cities with such weight can be a counterweight to national leaders. And a little bit more on sort of the urban-rural divide, which I think is super important in these conversations, especially with cities that have such big weight within the national economies. I mean, this topic has been, has come up regularly with with Brexit, the election of Donald Trump, the Gilets jaunes in France, all the different elections where we see these maps that look very similar across different countries. But I think it'd be interesting to look to scratch the surface a little bit, because the urban-rural divide is a bit of a catch-all term that includes geographic, generational, cultural, infrastructural, economic cleavages. And I think there's a concept by a French geographer, Christophe Guilly, which is interesting, which differentiates between cities and the periphery, and sort of the difference between thriving metropolitan cities and the periphery, which is defined by an absence or decline of prosperity and opportunity. And this is something that's, we've seen for a long time, and Saskia Sassen many years ago sort of already talked about how cities had traditionally been deeply embedded in regional economies, but more and more as they become sort of nodes of a global economy, they're becoming disconnected from their regions and their nation economically. And I think those are trends that we're seeing, and that have obviously strong policy and political implications. At the same time, when cities are becoming in many ways less accessible to low middle income workers, affordable housing is a major issue across many cities, while at the same time the discourse is often of cities being open, inclusive, and diverse, as opposed to a sort of national discourse of often more exclusion or less progressive in that sense. And it, being a flag bearer for openness and inclusion, while at the same time, not actually having people who can afford housing in the cities, or having highly segregated neighborhoods or inaccessible cities, it rings even more elitist or ironic to people who are not kind of within these cities. And this, this relates to a lot of work that's been done on sort of they call the geography of discontent, or revenge of places that don't matter, which I think also kind of ties back paradoxically to the issue of journalism and media, where when our opinion and views are often shaped by our geographies in a sort of media landscape that is more and more disconnected from geography. Sort of social media bubbles are sort of not so place-based, and it really, I think there needs to be a little bit more study and analysis in these areas. And then, of course, on sort of international engagement of cities and cross-city cooperation, Clara knows I'm very interested in this, and we've talked about it a few times, but I think it's quite interesting that while there are so many networks, city networks, as Clara points out in the paper, there's almost none that are explicitly focused on democracy until very recently. And with the Pact of Free Cities being signed by the V4 capital mayors in 2019, and which is being expanded internationally in the coming days, the Budapest Forum starting tomorrow, which is led by the recently created Budapest City Diplomacy Unit. And, in different ways, we're seeing a little bit an emergence of this international cooperation around cities and democracy, which we're very excited about and engaged in ourselves with our Cities Fortifying Democracy project and in other ways. And I'll finish just with this last reflection, just on kind of the taking a step back that I think is also important, which is just applying the lens of democracy to governance at the local level, which again is something that is not very common. And when we're looking or thinking about democratic backsliding in many countries, and we're seeing in certain countries in Europe that cities are really being the sort of and are on the front lines of this backsliding and kind of pushing back most actively and visibly. And cities really need to have that role. And, as the most trusted level of government across Europe and North America, it's really essential that cities really apply this lens to their work, because most city practitioners don't see their work as, fortifying democracy in many ways. They're looking at building effective, equitable cities. They're thinking about climate, all these different things, but everything that they're doing is actually repairing, fortifying, ultimately strengthening democracy in different ways. And I think it's important because it gives us a sense of urgency to this work and importance, which sometimes is just seen as regular day-to-day city work. And when cities are sort of well-governed, residents are heard and engaged, it can create in cities which are generally places of highest diversity in countries. And when you see really communities forming, thriving socially, culturally, economically, I think that's really the best case to make against populist and illiberal agendas, is really to kind of demonstrate in many cities how this can work. And I will leave it at that. And back to you, Daniel.
Thank you so much, Paul, for the great remarks. Clara, would you like to briefly reflect on Paul's points? Please go ahead.
Yes, I would, because he makes great points. So I would be happy to address some of them, not because you need to give feedback to feedback, but because I can provide some additional details for some of the points he raised. And I think that's where the conversation should be heading. So I'm going to start a little bit from the back, in the sense that I feel like any discussion on the future of cities in Europe and America has to figure out the proper balance between empowering these nodes of globalization, as Paul just accurately labeled them, and basically leaving masses of people and regions behind. So you can't really have any comfortable public policy without addressing this potential trade-off. Personally, I believe now, after all the research I've done for this policy paper, personally now I see a way forward that doesn't have to choose between the two, in the sense that if you do tinker public policies that can create those differentiated pathways to growth that I just mentioned, where you have a differing approach in terms of budgetary allocations, support mechanisms, developmental policies, you have a differing approach towards growing cities and shrinking cities, then you can accurately bridge their very differentiated needs, without leaving people behind, without leaving cohorts of people trapped in a subdevelopment that doesn't lead them to the neighboring cities in Central and Eastern Europe, but to Western cities. So that's kind of the very root of the depopulation and migration crisis that large Central and Eastern European countries like Romania, Bulgaria, even Hungary and Poland to a certain extent have faced over the past years. It's the fact that the shrinking cities cannot shift their population towards growing metropolitan areas, just like Paul mentioned. And here I would like to add the solution or the challenge that social services have been already decentralized heavily towards local governments. So the solution resides are firmly anchored within the capabilities of local government. Social housing, social assistance programs, social investments like kindergartens, hospitals, and so on. These are all firmly rooted within local government's attributes, capabilities. What they need to develop is know-how and human resource capabilities to actively develop those instruments into potential weapons to counter inequality and exclusion, because you still have massive bags of poverty even in growing metropolitan areas. So I think, yes, we need to figure out how to better develop inclusive systems, inclusive cities in practice. But I think the solution does reside at local level, and support should be designed at local level. Secondly, the idea of, these cities really holding back in terms of what they can do, both in Europe and America, because we have a lot of great examples to put on the table from America as well, and maybe a future conversation should be about that. And I think the idea would be to design the governance benchmarking objectives less in administrative terms and more in what we call municipal statecraft. So I'm working with some fellow scholars on this emerging literature, which is called Municipal Statecraft, and it builds on the idea of scaling up solutions and scaling up capabilities from local level. And a lot of those deal with economic growth and economic development, which is not at all what your post-communist administrative local governance structure has been designed to do. So we really need to figure out a way in which mayors and their leading public officials step out of the hat of the neighborhood administrator and step into the hat of an economic agent in its full-blown capacity, because they actually need to have a very proactive approach on their local development, both business and social affairs. And I think that's where I'll stop, and I'm happy to answer more questions and comments.
Thank you so much, Clara. Ladies and gentlemen, the Q&A is open, so please feel free to post your questions either in the Q&A box or via the chat function of Zoom. And I think we can make a first round. We already have a question from Rufin Zampia, who is asking you, Clara, whether the sheer number of cities in the individual Central and Eastern European countries is influencing the distribution in the subclusters of the graphs. And I also would like to abuse my role as moderator and in some regard, and had two questions to both of you. The first one is that I very much love this sheet with the multi-level recommendation with which you finished your presentation, and you show there what kind of remarkable role the international donor community could play, for example, in supporting the production of different local level, very complex indices, which are unfortunately not available today in a broader European or even Central and Eastern European context. And my question would be that what other or potential roles can you see for the international donor community, especially having in mind that donors are mostly interested in the support of civil society. So what could be the instruments, the points of intervention through which the support of local civil society could facilitate this kind of mutual engagement between civil society and local actors? And my second question would be just to play the role of the pessimistic Central and Eastern European, that if we take a look on the activities of the Eurocities or the Pact of the Free Cities, how they try to influence the MFF negotiations, and that EU funds should be available also for municipal players, and how they achieved moderate success in this regard to remain diplomatic. One could get the impression that in spite of all of these elephants who see themselves to be Moses, In fact, at EU level, the lobby power of the cities is indeed very moderate. In spite of the fact that we have the Committee of Region, that we have a parallel institutional framework under the aegis of the Council of Europe, simply city lobbies are not strong enough to be able to get all of these changes, what would be necessary to influence that kind of redistribution of regulatory power and fiscal power, what Clara was looking for. And therefore my question, what other venues could be used by local players, by cities, even by civil society, somehow to influence this redistribution of fiscal and regulatory power at member states level? Over to you. I don't know who would like to start.
I can start. I have my mic open, so I can start with the question from Rufin. And I think his question is very good in scientific terms. So you obviously you have more cities in Poland and Romania than you have in Hungary, and at the end of the day that could skew the distribution. But at the same time, what we did is to look at quartiles, and indeed you have, so for example in Romania you have kind of a split quartile between well-performing cities and less performing cities, and what's in terms of mutual engagement. And what's interesting is that it's not a rule to have a larger, so in general, across the three countries, richer cities have larger civic engagement. But at the same time, it's not a rule to have larger mutual engagement, depending on the economic or population size of the city. What I mean is that sometimes local governments in smaller cities can have a very innovative approach, a very proactive governance approach, and obviously open governance. And I think that links back to the conversation we had earlier in terms of who are the specialized people within local governments and how the future ready resource, human resource should be designed for local governments instead of your everyday administrator, people with more sophisticated skills in engagement and international affairs. So I think, coming back to Rufin's question, I think there is definitely a way to frame in comparative terms the issue with more cities in Romania and Poland in the better performing quarters than in Hungary, that's for sure, because we look at quartiles. But also at the end of the day, yes, the more cities you have in Poland, the better chances you have of things getting right. We control with quartiles. That's the short answer for Rufin. Coming back to the broader question from Daniel in terms of IOs, I think, there are two ways that Paul just answered, sort of in ways to strengthen mutual engagement via civil society. And one could be investigative journalism at local level, which I also think it's a very big part of this checks and balances story. Of course, some of the outputs of governance you can see on the streets. You see if your parking lot has been refurbished or your kids' playground has been refurbished. But then the problems, the issues, you don't always see on the streets. So the good part you can observe on your own, but the bad part is something that local journalism should probably take care of and cover. And I think that's an important aspect of having proper checks and balances at local level. Now, the second one, and it wasn't mentioned by Paul, but I mentioned it in the policy paper. The second one is strengthening national civic society platforms to conduct projects at local level. And why I say this is the fact that you don't have a lot of CSOs at local level that have capacity to implement projects and to engage in meaningful dialogue with local authorities. There is, again, the issue of sophistication and human resource skill. You have quite a few national platforms that are well performing at the moment in Central and Eastern Europe through years of financing from the IOs and the European Commission. So I think what you need to do is to match them and to force, in financing eligibility terms, to force national platforms to team up with local CSOs and provide this type of on-site nurturing of local skills and competencies, because no IOs you will be able to teach a local CSO how to ask for information from his local government. That's something your national actors should transfer the knowledge towards local groups. And I think the third question in terms of how cities can better represent themselves within the EU, that's a very tough question, because you have it's very politicized. You have the Renew European political family that supports cities' stance because it has a lot of votes in urban areas, both in Central and Eastern Europe and in Western Europe. So, you end up in the trade-off that we were discussing earlier with kind of providing a politicized agenda, maybe. I'm a firm supporter that cities need more powers, but it matters how we shape the conversation. So it's not through the political families that I see a greater support, but through peer-to-peer networks. And you have a growing mass of peer-to-peer platforms. Unfortunately, the Central and Eastern European cities are not well represented. So you have only a few leading cities with good skills. In Cluj, you have a former prime minister who's mayor. Of course, he's going to engage very well at international level. What you need is to figure out how to bring those smaller secondary city actors that can and should play a greater role in their national economy and in their national democratic struggles, but they don't have the capacity to engage in broader networking platforms and capabilities. So, this is a point of international affairs officers that we kept on discussing within the GMF community, and I think that's a very important point to make.
Yeah, and maybe just to add very quickly to what Clara said, I think on the issue of the sort of the philanthropic community or international donor community, I think one of the challenges, and Clara mentioned this, is really this peer-to-peer sharing, because it's really not within traditional work and competences of local city practitioners to be looking all around the world at what other cities are doing and how they're dealing with certain challenges, and what, how that could inspire their work, or how that could lead to new things there. So this level of sharing really needs to be supported in some way, because it's not as easy as seeing a best practice case written in a PDF and saying, okay, let's apply that in our city. It takes a lot more thought. It takes a lot more interaction of hearing from others how they did it, what the challenges were, how this could apply to your local sort of jurisdiction, and sort of all the different ways that it's obviously not, you can't copy paste it, but there are ways that it can be interesting. And there's so much going on in different cities in all of these areas that is very interesting. The use of technology and online platforms for participatory decision making, UBI pilots in different cities, deliberative policymaking forums in different cities, expanding the vote in municipal elections to youth and to people over the 16 and 17-year-olds, involving non-citizens. So a lot of our major capital cities have 20 to 30% residents who are not nationals and who are excluded from the democratic processes of the city. And sort of all these things are really interesting for cities to learn from each other, but they just don't have the time or the resources to really focus on that adequately. And so I think that's one area where there can be a lot more help, even though, like I said, there are a ton of city networks. There is a lot of exchange, but I still think that should be an area for more work. And then, just to add one point, I agree with what Clara said on sort of how cities can influence policymaking, obviously sort of it is very politicized, and it's helpful to be aligned with different levels of government when you want to achieve certain things. And political, punishment shouldn't be the norm in democratic societies for being of a different party. But when that is the case, highlighting it is already better than nothing, and just making clear that this is sort of a political punishment that is being sort of handed to certain cities or regions. And then to maybe sort of help in depoliticizing it, I think not just international but national city associations can carry a lot of weight with specific recommendations, and can also help maybe depoliticize by depersonalizing it. So it's not the mayor of the capital city who's demanding to be able to decide their tax rate, but it is an association of cities or a group of cities who see that in their interests. And of course, better if it's sort of across political and party lines, but still, obviously, that requires some level of political alignment and agreement, even if it's at the local level.
Thank you so much, Paul. I think we partially already touched upon the issue, but still, Mario Soner is asking that in the case of CSO disengagement, what can be done at local level to motivate local civil society that they make use of the available different offers of the municipal authorities at the field of transparency, participation, and so on. And I again would like to have a question. I really loved Paul's comment in the previous round when he claimed that a very few number of local politicians see their roles as being a kind of democracy defender, just because they try to operate democratic cities. And my first question would be, on the one hand, how can this narrative be spread and be made more attractive in the community of local politicians? And the second one, whether this demand is not in contradiction with your latest point, that practically, if there is a conflict between a municipal player and the national governance, then potentially the most suitable venue is to depoliticize the issue. Over to you. I think in this case you can start, Paul.
Yeah, no, I think both are true, and that's part of the challenge. I mean, it's tough to get. I think sadly, this role of local leaders and mayors as sort of defenders of democracy, I think, has been inspired because of backsliding and because of challenges and because of problems and polarization and trends that have kind of forced it upon them, and that's obviously not good. But I hope that can be used to really consolidate this lens as something that is valuable, because I think it also opens up different avenues for policies and projects. What I mentioned earlier about youth voting and non-citizen voting and all these things where I think we haven't thought enough about, even in sort of the most functioning consolidated democracies, we haven't really thought about that there's still plenty of people who are excluded from democratic processes. And I think it's easier, or it's more readily done at a city level when these people are, people excluded are your neighbors, they're your colleagues, they're the people that, are part of the very fabric of society that you sort of interact with on a daily basis, than in this sort of abstract conceptual, this new group that we're, expanding the demos to, and we don't really know who they are or what they, how they will vote either. And your first question, I don't remember, but I will leave. On sort of civil society and transparency, I'll leave. I just want to make one small comment, and I'll obviously leave that and the other question to Clara. But I think one thing that is important, and I think this is also an area where maybe international community and donors can help, it is in the processing of data. So transparency on its own can often not be very useful. I mean, if you leave a database open for people to sift through, it takes capacity and knowledge to be able to make use of that in different ways and to process it, either in the civil society side or on the municipal side, for cities to be able to share data in a way that is useful for civil society, for business, or for the international community use. So I'll leave it there for that.
Thank you, Paul. Clara.
Sure, great points that Paul made. So I'm going to start with the latter because I think, you know, we need not to think that any type of openness from local governments is substantial. Sometimes it's just a formal you know, checking up of criteria that they think they need to fulfill. Sometimes they actually need by law, as in the case of Polish municipalities. But publishing stuff on a website is not necessarily meaningful interaction and responsiveness on the part of local governments. So obviously, I'm showing the type of data that can be presented in a comparative manner, but at the end of the day, the data has to be supplemented by local stories. Some are, you know, good stories, some are bad stories. Some governments are actually engaging with their citizens and cooperating with their citizens. Other are just refrain to the formal, which is something I argue in the paper. I think as a first step is transparency. Transparency does not automatically mean substantial openness and engagement, but it is a first step for those citizens and civil society organizations that actually want to see and figure out what's going on in their cities. So the first step is transparency of data. And now coming back to the question, because the question was on the civil society capabilities, and I think I briefly answered it earlier with the national and local platforms. So national platforms that should integrate local partners, because, you know, we were looking in Romania at who got the funding from EU sources for civil society, and you had funding for different regions, for different counties, but at the end of the day, the beneficiaries were coming from Bucharest, Cluj, and you know, Iași, and so you have very, very high concentration. And what the civil society groups at local level can do, you know, is to access the knowledge base within their own communities. And I think, I mean, as far as I could tell, in all three countries, there is a relatively open environment within the civil society groups. So there is some territorialism, but there is also a lot of openness to communicate via all the new online platforms, social media, etc. So at the end of the day, the peer-to-peer learning has to work both in civil society and in local governments. And in terms of the broader question of the tension between local and national, and I'm going to be very short on that, I think I myself romanticize a little bit the stance that cities currently have in strengthening democracy vis-a-vis national governments or backsliding national governments. But then again, what you want for is not these type of you know, champion cities that protect democracy at local level. What you want is a well-functioning vertical intergovernmental cooperation mechanism. So as romantic as Budapest and Warsaw might be, or Zagreb lately, what we actually need is broad consensus on the vertical intergovernmental cooperation line. And that doesn't, you know, that needs openness and collaboration from different political groups.
Thank you so much, Clara. Just a very brief remark from my end to the latest point and the romanticizing of the role of these leading cities. I think that irrespectively whether we romanticize or not, there is only a very limited pool of best practices from Central and Eastern Europe, especially from those two countries which are most affected by autocratization, Poland and Hungary, how democratic actors can challenge democratic backsliding. But among the best practices which exist, I think an overproportionally big amount is related to local democratic actors. So it's not necessarily a kind of romanticizing when we simply accept that as a matter of fact that nowadays democratic cities and municipalities play a crucial role in protecting democracy and in Central and Eastern Europe. And I think my intention was not to use this phrase as a kind of closing word, but but it can be or can fulfill that role as well. I think we are approaching the end of our webinar, ladies and gentlemen. Clara, Paul, I would like to say a big thank you for both of you for being with us and sharing your insights with us. Ladies and gentlemen, many thanks also for being with us today. Have a nice day and hopefully see you next time. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.